Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, and I am joined today by Martin Zellner, Frody Midjord, and Academic Agent, all guests who certainly need no introduction, but will indeed give them an opportunity to introduce themselves here in a bit, just to shill at the beginning of the stream and to let people know where they can be followed and all the rest. The subject of our discussion today will be is America the enemy of Europe? I'm not only interested in sort of, going back and forth with the dialectic about this. I'm also interested in this framing, in taking a look at, the cui bono of all of this, whether, if indeed anyone benefits from fostering this narrative, who that might be. And there are a number of other, aspects of definition of digging in a bit deeper to this question. But just to let everyone know, I'm not looking here for some kind of blood sports interaction. I'm perfectly happy to be disagreed with or to see disagreements among members of the panel. But this is intended ultimately to be a productive exercise. Hopefully my audio is coming through. If there are any problems with the audio of any of our guests today or mine, let me know in the chat and I'll attempt to address it as quickly as I can. Please do follow me here. You can follow me on X as well. I've got some books for sale below, but I'm going to cut my shilling short today because I want to get to our guests. I'm very happy they are all here today, regardless of whether or not I agree with everything they say. I'm looking at you, Academic Agent. I like and respect all these men. I'm very, very happy to have them on today. So before we jump into the larger topic, maybe just sort of going clockwise around the circle, starting with Frody here. Can you guys introduce yourselves and let people know where they can follow you? And if you have anything coming up, mention it here at the outset. We'll do so again at the close.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here in good company. Frody Midjord is my name. I have a channel called Guide to Culture, GTK Radio. GTKradio.com is the website. I have a Twitter. I have a Telegram and an Odyssey channel. I do a weekly show with Mark Webber, American historian. It's called Weekly Roundup. We do it every Tuesday evening where we do news and current events commentary. I organize a conference called the Scanza Forum, which I've been doing for, 10 years now. I think I organized the first conference in 2015. And I've been involved in these issues of political analysis, I guess, and these things in one form or another since the late 90s, and these topics. So you can find me on the website, and thank you for having me on here.
Yes, my pleasure. AA?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Oliver. Been a while. I have a channel, Academic Agent. I have a format now where I do videos daily. I do a live stream on Tuesdays called Office Hours. In fact, Frody, for many years, I did a show on Tuesday evenings called Unpopular Opinions. And my regular thing was listen to your show with Mark Webber. And then it was very helpful because it meant that I could kind of take some of your takes and things. Now I do my show before.
Glad to
now
be
I
of
do
help.
my show beforehand, so I can't do that anymore. But some people may know me from the book The Populist Delusion or Prophets of Doom, and I also sell courses at the Academic Agency. And I want to say before we have this conversation, I grew up in Margaret Thatcher's Great Britain, drinking Coca-Cola, watching He-Man, pro wrestling, and going to McDonald's was my biggest treat. So I was a very loyal subject of the American Empire all through my youth, and I've been to America many times. And anything I say in criticism is meant from a place of love for the country that I admire so much.
That's fair. That's fair. And I thank you for it, AA, and very happy to have you here. Martin, sir.
Yeah, my name is Martin Zellner. I'm an activist and author based in Austria, Vienna. I'm a spokesperson for Generation Identity and Activist Street Movement. I've written several books, Right-Wing Regime Change and Remigration being the latest. And I mostly produce German content, unfortunately, but there's also sometimes English tweets on my X account, Martin _Sellner, and I have an English Rumble and Telegram channel. But the most interesting thing at the moment might be a short information page that I've set up, whatis.remigration.eu, where I briefly try to explain what we mean by this very important term. And also for my relationship to America, I was a very classic new right European anti-Americanist. So Benoit and all these anti-American positions, I shared them, and then I met my wife, who's an American, and I actually traveled to the country and got to know a lot of people in the country better. And I think I also might have a very very interesting position on this, because my philosophical, my ideological background is traditional European conservatism, which is quite critical of America, but also I have my personal experience of the country and of the people, which I follow academic age and I also really like personally.
Yes. Thank you all for being here. For my own part, I've traveled a good bit more than most Americans have. I lived on the borders of Europe and Turkey for 6 years. I've been to most of the European countries. I've stayed in some of them for months at a time. I love traveling to Europe. I have many European friends, and my wife is fresh off the boat from Europe. So for those who are hoping for just a strict sort of Procrustean black and white dialectical take on this, I think you're probably going to be disappointed, but we will see as it unfolds. So let me get started here. On the one hand, and this will take me just a moment to get through, but then I'm going to turn it over primarily to you gentlemen and just try to keep the conversation moving. But on the one hand, you can say the case can be made that the U.S. and Europe are currently in conflict, and that the conflict will worsen. Since Trump took office, tensions between the U.S. and Europe have escalated. There's the question of trade policies, whether enacted or threatened, concerns about divergent security priorities. There's Trump's threats of sweeping tariffs on the EU. There's Canada as well. And just for the record, I hope to be hosting very soon a similar panel on whether or not Canada and the U.S. are in fact enemies at this point. That is currently in the works. I've got a slate of good guests, and I hope to make that happen soon. There's the business of the United States putting heavy pressure on Europe, as Trump did first time around, to increase spending in terms of NATO commitments. And we've got things like, leaders viewing the U.S. as an unreliable ally. We've got the private texts from Trump officials, expressing disdain for Europe. So there's a further erosion of trust there. We've got the EU's push towards military autonomy. We'll see what transpires with that. There's the potential alignment of Europe with alternative partners. And as Trump is doubling down on his America First policies, there are a lot of people out there in the commentariat who predict a worsening trade war and a strategic divide, and perhaps even a fracture of what gets called the post-World War II alliance. That should obviously be placed in scare quotes. On the other hand, you can say that despite initial concerns, the news since Trump's inauguration suggests the U.S. and Europe are not in outright conflict. There are diplomatic efforts, such as Trump calling Prime Minister Carney, that kind of thing. There's the hours-long discussion with Putin on the Ukraine and Middle East stuff. Depending on your views on the Ukraine war, you could see that as a positive or a negative development. And the European leaders, while they are certainly skeptical, and that's putting it charitably, regarding Trump's Ukraine peace push and Trump's ways of doing things in general, these leaders have not severed ties. And the U.S. continues to engage with allies on global security issues. There's still economic cooperation. So these interactions suggest a strained but a functional partnership, with both sides adapting to Trump's approach rather than descending into to conflict. So there are a number of questions I hope that all of you will touch on. There's a sort of primary questions as I see it, and please feel free to introduce others. But a primary one is the EU in conflict with the US, or vice versa? Is this even true? A second question, regardless of whether it's true, whom does this narrative serve? That's the cui bono I mentioned earlier. Third, what is the proper way to deal with this if it is true or if it's untrue? And in order to ask or answer these questions, there are a number of more granular points. Is it that the US is Europe's enemy, or is it that Europe is an enemy of the US, or both? How do we define the US and Europe? Are we talking about elite ruling factions? Are we talking about national governments? Or, as I said, transnational elite ruling factions? Are we talking about national populations? In Europe, do we assume that Brussels is in charge? Another question is Britain really in Europe? Or looking at Europe taken as a whole, if the United States has problems only with Denmark, not saying that it's only Denmark, but for example, does that mean Italy is our enemy? Are we talking about a fixed state of enmity, or are we talking about something episodic or changing? And how are we to understand the dynamic without taking into account minority populations, or fifth columns, or competing factions within nations? For example, is the EU against the US Democrat Party, or is it more about Trump? Should the US, and this is a very interesting question for me, probably won't be able to get into it much here, but I think it does bear on this question, or on the previous questions that I've been laying out. Should the US and Britain really be distinguished? Most Americans and Brits would probably say yes, or hell yes, but I suspect that there are many continental European nationalists who see little reason to view British and American influence as very much different, given the obvious historical continuity. And of course, all of this is only a partial picture. We have to put some sort of, four walls, a floor, and a ceiling around the topic, or it's just going to range everywhere. But I think it's unwise, it should be said, to consider Europe and the US without considering Russia, for example, as well, and perhaps even China. And at root, I think a great deal of the tension seems to be associated with the prospect that the US and Russia might start to cooperate, perhaps. So all that being said, and again, I want to mention dialectical framing tends to be Procrustean, however useful it is in bringing in argumentative viewers. So hopefully we can get outside of a simple, sort of both and, either or, neither nor dialectics. So with that said, maybe we can go clockwise around the group again, and dig into what this is, what your take is, what you think is happening here. Frody, you want to jump in?
All right. I'll start then. Yeah, first of all, I do think we have to distinguish between the people of America and the elites, just like you said, because I think that from a European and just like a civilizational, just human quality perspective, I think Americans are, as individuals, as the people who went there, and also the people who created American culture up to at least the Second World War, 50s, and so on, created some of the most brilliant culture during that period. And they were very high quality, probably the highest quality, most intelligent people from Europe who went to America. So I think as individuals, Americans are probably at least as admirable as Europeans. But as a political system, as a political entity, America is probably the worst entity on the planet. So it is important to make that distinction, so that when I criticize America, it is entirely the political system, the political ruling class, and in some ways the political culture, which I think is also problematic. So I'm highly critical of America as a political entity, but I have great admiration for America as a country and as for the people who live there, and for the culture, which was a high culture before it became more trivialized in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and onwards. What's happening now, I think we can see it as the breakdown, as many people have observed, the breakdown of the unipolar world. Marco Rubio came out earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, in an interview with Megyn Kelly, and he said that the unipolar moment is over and the multipolar world is here. And that is a remarkable statement that has not received attention in proportion to how important it is. I mean, some people did bring attention to the statement, but I think it didn't get enough attention compared to how important it is, because I think it is probably the most important statement, perhaps since the Second World War, at least since the end of the Cold War. So it is a very important thing that the American Secretary of State acknowledged that the American political global hegemony is over. Of course, political scientists and commentators, both American and outside of America, have acknowledged this sort of trend away from the unipolar moment. But the fact that an American leader, a top representative of the American government, says this in public, I think that's significant. So it's clear that there's a change going on. I've talked about it as decline and turbo decline of the American global power. So that also can explain the attitude toward Europe. I think that with respect to the EU, in the past, America supported the EU because America still wanted to maintain its hegemony over Europe. And when you do that, when you want to control a big area like Europe, you want to do it through one lever. If you can maintain contact with just one big entity, or not only, but mainly through one entity, you can control that power relationship through one lever. But now, when the American hegemony is breaking down and American global power is retreating, that is going to change. And so I think that the new American establishment under the leadership of Donald Trump sees the EU as an entity that is a competitor. So he sees the EU not as an enemy. I think that's that would imply that there's like a conflict. But I think that as a competitor in the area of economy and so on. And in that respect, since America no longer wishes to control Europe in a military or economic sense, it makes more sense for America to see Europe broken down into smaller, more digestible pieces, because it's easier for a big country like America to win negotiations or to exercise power in the smaller sense against a smaller country. And so I think that's why both Russia and the US now wish to see Europe broken down into smaller, more digestible pieces that they can more easily manipulate in a competitive situation. So I think that from the American point of view, the view on Europe has changed. So that in the past, in the unipolar moment and in the post-World War II paradigm, the US wanted to control Europe. Now, the American leaders see that American power is stretched too thin. It needs to retreat, and so they don't have the resources to maintain the global power that they've had, and so they want to retreat. And so it is easier for them to deal with smaller units in Europe, and so they probably would like to see a decreased power of EU And the same goes for Russia, of course, because Russia wants to exercise power in Eastern Europe. They want to project their power into the post-Soviet sphere, the post-Soviet space, and it's easier to do that. It's easier to deal with Latvia than to deal with all of EU with like 500 million people. So that's an easier negotiating position for Russia and the US. And from my point of view, what I think of the EU, I think, both in a good way and in a bad way, the EU is a completely soulless entity. And we can criticize the EU because it was set up, and all these sort of color-y ambitions and so on to deracinate Europe and to, in many ways, destroy Europe. But fortunately, the EU doesn't have a soul of its own. It's just an administrative mechanism, basically, for cooperation. And as such, I think it can quite easily be turned into something good or something bad. It's sort of like a gun, it's the person who holds it who decides to use it for something good or for something bad. So because the EU is so soulless, a soulless bureaucracy, it can be turned either way. I mean, so I think that probably now in the current competitive situation and the so-called multipolar order, it is better for Europe to maintain itself as and try to build itself up as an independent pole on the global stage of competition of power. So I guess that's sort of my opening salvo.
Very good. Thank you. I think there's a very interesting point there. I think we are going to see levers stuck into the EU from many points, both by the Americans, the Russians as well. I can already see that Italy seems to be taking a slightly different line from others. But the details remain to be seen. Academic agent, sir, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, before we get on to the kind of current situation, I think, it is necessary to get a few like fundamentals on the table, because in my various kind of back and forths with Americans over the years, and especially recently, one of the things that always strikes me, and I don't know if it strikes the other people on the panel too, is the extent to which Americans deny actually being an empire. It's kind of schizophrenic attitude towards this. Sometimes they lean into it and kind of go full neocon. At other times, it's like, oh no, actually, all the things that happen in Europe are a result of, decisions that European leaders have made. And this is a question that has, been of great interest to me. And it is also a question before a lot of other questions as well. Like, for example, who is responsible for political correctness? Who is responsible for, mass immigration and the browning of Europe and things like that? And obviously, that is a massive question. And I've got, what was it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 books on this question here, of which 3 are from a European point of view by European authors. 4 are by British authors, and 2 are by American authors, effectively kind of revealing, I guess, what American power has been up to all of these years. And I think it's worth just going through the broad line findings from these various books in order to establish where I'm coming from and why I think the things I do. Because one of the tricky things about the American empire, if you want to call it an empire, is that unlike almost every previous empire in history, it has never called itself an empire. It's never admitted to be an empire, and it has always been informal, right? It's kind of it's never been drummed into people's heads that, for example, the British Prime Minister answers formally to the American president, even though this is a de facto reality. You understand what I'm saying? But the extent to which this was actually made. This was actually, this thing that we're talking about, this empire, was built after World War II. It is something that is just worth reminding ourselves. The 3 European books I have, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on each of these, but it's just worth reminding ourselves of some of these details. One is by Tomislav Sunik, called Homo Americanus. I don't know if he's a friend of yours, Frody, but one is by Hans Vogel. It's called How Europe Became American, and one is by an economist called Marie-Laurie Jellick, and it's called Exporting the American Model. I think that is a French author. One of the things that really struck me as someone who's a Brit, essentially, reading these books, was it actually struck me how many of my own views are kind of like Anglo-centric or British chauvinism or whatever. For example, the Hans Vogel book, just in passing, mentions a ton of things that the Germans invented, and I was like, hold on a second, I thought Britain invented that. I thought that Britain did that. I thought so like, it was just really striking to be like, oh, this is a whole like type of like view of history and view of things from a very European German point of view that I had not encountered before. But anyway, what all 3 of these books make really, really clear is that if you strip away all the ideology, all of the what I call boomer truth and Winston Churchill and FDR and Hitler and all the rest of it, if you just strip all of that away, what actually happened in 1945 is that America basically invaded Europe and occupied most of Europe, and then went about imposing all of its various structures on Europe. So this book, Exporting the American Model, shows literally how European business practices were basically torn down and built back up. Sunik and Vogel basically go into the denazification process and, essentially the psychological warfare that was enacted by the Allied powers, led by America, on the Germans. So on a cultural level, on an economic level, and then, of course, on the military level, even today, Germany and Japan aren't allowed, a proper army, and they're still occupied nations. So, so anybody reading these 3 books cannot really come out the other end and say, well, is Germany really, does it have autonomy? Is it allowed its own foreign policy? Really? So that's one thing. And I think the Ukraine situation brought that home a little bit, because let's not forget, Nord Stream 2 was a project that Angela Merkel had been working on for 15 years or something, billions of euros or whatever, up in smoke, because it was not amenable to American foreign policy for Germany and Russia to have that alliance. Classic kind of Mackinder policy. So those are the 3 European books. Then from the British side, I've got Imperial Obituary by Major General Richard Hilton, a book called The New Unhappy Lords by A.K. Chesterton, who was the leader of a group called the League of British Empire Loyalists that existed in the 1950s, and a book by a guy who was like a kind of base Tory MP called The Uncertain Ally by John Biggs Davison, which basically tells the story from the British point of view, from a kind of British patriotic point of view, just how much America screwed over Britain, during and after World War II, and how it basically used World War II as an excuse to break up the British Empire, take over its assets, and essentially become the world hegemon. And it goes into a lot of, not just the Suez Crisis, but a lot of other individual moments in the kind of where America really does screw over Britain in quite a devastating way. Then the 2 books by Americans I've got here, one is called America Conquers Britain by L. Denny, which was written in the interwar period, that is between World War I and World War II, which shows how this process basically started already in the aftermath of World War I, where basically American bankers, American business interests go in and then, using various proxies and things, start buying up British assets, after the Great War, when the country was in debt. Then the other American author here, Francis Stoner Saunders, is a book called Who Paid the Piper, which is a mind-blowing book in many ways, which literally shows the CIA basically inventing the non-communist left in Europe and the, I guess you'd say, the non-fascist or non, like, the modern center-right. So it shows that the center-left, the European center-left and the European center-right in Europe were literally invented by the CIA and perpetuated by none other than James Burnham himself. I mean, like, this is the sort of book that if I'd read 10 years ago, I would have thought you were crazy or something. But when you actually put all these things together and simply see it as like, well, actually what World War II was a massive power grab by America in which it formally or informally occupied all of these countries and took over its various assets and imposed its rules, its structures, then it starts to make sense. One of the things that they go into is that all of the things that you'd think of, like racial equality and discrimination and what we'd call today political correctness or even social justice, many of these things were more or less imposed as part of this structure because, let's face it, the right wing was banned or has been banned in Europe because of the Moustache Man. Final book I've got here is called Someone Else's Empire by Tom Stevenson, which is called British Illusions and American Hegemony. And I find this book very interesting because one of the things that really bugs me, Oliver, as you know too well, is this idea that some Americans have that secretly, actually, the British are somehow weirdly still in control of what we call, global American empire, or, somehow or other, the British are still really running things. And what this book by Tom Stevenson does is it basically really shows how delusional the British defense and foreign departments are. And this whole, this is basically the like Tony Blair leading the Iraq War type idea, that if only we can be the kind of the real big cheerleaders for America in the world, but through the back door, this will give us some influence and standing. And he just lays bare in this book just how delusional and it's just a cope basically for the British ruling class to pretend to be relevant in some way. So when I add all of that up and I think, well, all of those actions that were taken over that 80-year period from the end of World War II to now, let's just say it in an adult way rather than saying, well, friend and enemy. America is just not Europe. So it's got its own interests. It's got its own, it's not going to do things that are going to be of benefit to other places. It's going to do things that benefit it, that expand its power, etc. So in a strange way, the idea of America first is kind of, viewed from one perspective, it's kind of a lie, because America has always been America first, all the way through from Woodrow Wilson to now. All of its actions have basically been, to enlarge its own power and to diminish European power, which, from the pure John Mearsheimer point of view, great power politics, makes sense, right? You don't, this is what power entities are. They're kind of like psychopathic in a way. They don't really have friends or enemies. So they just have interests in that way. So yeah, that's the kind of my opening idea here, because people basically agree with these facts that I've laid on the ground. It's very difficult to then have a conversation. If you think, well, actually, that 80-year period that we're talking about, what was really happening is that all of the European countries were autonomous. They had their own governments, they had their own foreign policy, and they didn't have these structures imposed on it. And actually, America was doing us a favor all this time. And then it's very difficult to have that conversation because we don't even agree on what the facts are. So that's my kind of opening gambit, as it were.
Thank you. And I certainly agree that the United States wasn't just in Europe handing out favors. And there's much here that we could go into. For example, Germany, in fact, has one of the 3 largest armies in Europe if you leave out Russia and Turkey, which I think most people would, and Ukraine. It's just 20,000 active troops or so below France and Poland, who also have very, very large armies. That's not to say they haven't been occupied. That's not to say that they haven't been the lucky, as it were, recipients of all sorts of psychological warfare and constraint. So I acknowledge that problem. It's also interesting to start the assessment of what happened with the end of World War II instead of looking earlier. You did mention Wilson, but there are all kinds of things going on that would suggest at least as late as the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the situation was not as quite as simple as you would frame it. Basically, the United States lent $4.4 billion to Europe. To Britain in World War I, and that comes out to like 95 billion in today's dollars, and less than half of that was repaid by Britain. And I believe financial games going on there had something to do with the Depression and the rest. But this is not the place for it, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that the fundamental points you laid out there, AA, are incorrect. I think it is important to acknowledge the role the United States has played in putting a kind of straitjacket on Europe. And I also agree that the idea that America was just handing out favors and our Euro poor friends across the Atlantic are really just all leftists and they don't do anything for themselves. I think that's all nonsense. And so the majority of the points you made there, I think, are very fair. Martin, thank you for waiting so patiently. What are your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, thank you for all this very, very interesting expositions about the whole issue. I want to go back to the title of this talk: Is America the enemy of Europe? I don't think it's the enemy of Europe, as say it's an existential threat that needs to be destroyed and defeated, but definitely it's an adversary of Europe, especially if you really go into the step of a multipolar world where Europe becomes a sovereign actor itself, which it obviously, and I agree with academic agent, isn't at the moment. I think the European elites right now, the old European elites, are maybe in a similar situation as the elites of the Soviet satellite states in 1985, like the GDR, when Gorbachev took power and then started his policy of glasnost and perestroika. Those elites knew that with especially glasnost, which meant less censorship, they would immediately lose their power. And in a way, you've seen an ideological shift in the new Moscow, the center of political power in America and Washington, that also affects the satellite states. And I think they cannot really deal with that. And in a way, just like the GDR, German Democratic Republic, and some other dictatorships hoped for the old Soviet Union to return in order for them to suppress the people longer, some of them obviously hope for the old liberal, benevolent dictatorship of America to return and to come back. And in the last final days of the Soviet Union, there are some conspiracies about that, especially the GDR. The Soviet Secret Service actually was financing the anti-communist revolutions and movements and controlling them, helping them, because they needed them as a pawn, as an instrument against those leaderships who were against glasnost and perestroika in order to control them. And that's also maybe the reason why Elon Musk now is supporting the AfD, and it might also lead to very interesting alliances. So I agree with most of you here that we are going into a multipolar world. I really hope that Europe is pushed back into history, is forced to become sovereign. And I also think that Americans and America as a state, doesn't matter which ruling ideology they have, will always stay an adversary, especially a non-spatial power who has different interests because they're just not in the region. What they want, what also I think Russia wants and China wants, is to turn Europe into a new 30-year war era, where basically, as Clausewitz once said, all the foreign powers are playing like on the chessboard with different nations. We talked about Prometheanism once. It's kind of a neo-Prometheanism, where obviously also the nationalism of certain nations will be boosted by American, by Russian, by Chinese interests. So I think in the future it will be very important to create a European consciousness, a European brotherhood against it. But, and that's also the end of my opening statement, the real enemy is within. Our enemy, and now I'm using the word enemy very precisely, the existential threat, our own elites, is the ideology of globalism, those elites who organize our replacement, our repression, our distraction, the dissolution of our ethno-cultural identity. And as America is the center of this ideology, or maybe was the center of this ideology, it was an enemy power, but there seems to be an ideological shift, or at least power struggle in America. And I say the most important thing we need to focus on is the great replacement, the demographic replacement, and our own elites who are controlling it, boosting it, camouflaging it. So I think we need to see all of this, what's going on in this frame of, does it help us for a real patriotic change, a patriotic democratic regime change, and a stop for the demographic replacement? Because everything else can be overturned. Everything is reversible. Just look at how well the former Soviet satellite states do now in terms of demography. So any geopolitical, cultural, economic crisis can be overcome, but the great replacement is irreversible. So I think that's how we need to see it. And I see a lot of chances in this new multipolar world, in this new conflict, also foreign powers over this emerging Europe, in this strange situation our elites are right now against the glasnost and perestroika of Trump. I see a lot of chances for power growth of patriotic forces and of making remigration a reality in the next decades. That would be my opening statement. Also, I would like to hear what you think about this comparison between Trump and Gorbachev. I stole it from a German journalist who brought it up. It's been debated by many people in Germany. And I think a very interesting talking point also would be, how should we as Europeans react now when our European leaders suddenly call for arms and call us to the arms, call for patriotism, especially in Germany? They want to now recreate the draft. You see Green Party leaders who say it's a duty, solidary duty to defend your country even with arms. So that's happening right now. And the language, I think, is becoming very clear. They want to try to frame and blame us as traitors to the nation, as Russian assets. And this will also, I think, when we look at Romania, be the most important instrument of the democracy simulation in the future to shut down, ban the opposition, revert democratic votes, and to basically totally repress us. So I think this is the most important and pressing questions. And this would be a few things maybe to talk, debate, and think about.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to some of the things that you raised, particularly the business of rearming, I expect Freddie will have some very interesting things to say about that. But before we turn to that, you mentioned Prometheism. And for those who don't know, we did a stream previously about that, Martin and myself, as well as a number of other guests, Charlemagne. But that was a strategy developed by Piłsudski, a military guy and statesman in Poland. And that was earlier in the 20th century. And the basic idea was to peel off elements of the Russian Empire and basically move them into the column of problems for Russia instead of being assets for Russia. And you could see that today, arguably at least, with the progress of NATO expansion, the Prometheanism, these ideas, they moved from Poland to Britain, and from Britain through figures like Brzezinski, whose whose father had been born and educated in Lvov. They moved to the United States and arguably at least became a part of U.S. foreign policy to basically separate Western Europe from Russia by activating this band of Eastern European states as something to block economic and energy relationships between Russia and the further western parts of Europe, and as a way to wind them up and turn them back against Russia. And that's certainly a part of the picture that we see today. I just wanted to give context for that because I think it bears on the question of rearmament, the motivations for that, and the rest. But I wanted to ask one very, very quick question to you, Martin, before maybe we move to Frody to start the next round of response. From what I've seen of the EU, because they are trying to impose a supranational structure in the form of this union via the economic door, it was previously some sort of coal and energy consortium, and then it was the economic community, if I remember correctly. The EU seems perfectly willing to divide previous sort of European national compromises in order to increase its own pressure by fomenting differences within countries. Ireland, for example, after becoming a republic, moved into the EU. Certainly, I think that the threat of nationalism within specific European countries is often offset by the EU by agitating for smaller regions to seek the protection of the EU against what they see as the impositions of their national government. So, like Catalonia, something like this. So we have this sort of, as it was described, a sort of soulless EU that therefore could kind of go in either direction. But we see that it agitates for the breakdown of national compromises that date from the period of nationalism and are reflected on the map, at least in terms of lines and borders, as what we recognize as states today. So I wonder, I'm not articulating this very well, but it raises the question of the EU itself relative to the things that you're talking about. Is it really that the European nations are rearming, or is it the European Union is rearming? Of course, there will be some degree of both as the nature of the exercise. As each nation produces its army, these all then in aggregate become the forces that the European Union can marshal. But at the same time, we see that the EU, up until the present at least, has tended to weld states together and to agitate with the minority groups within each of these states. And I'm not here talking about Turks or Algerians. I'm talking about, well, perhaps we haven't seen it so much in Belgium between, the Flemish and the Walloons. How does that background of this project attempting to weld these states together relate to your points about the opportunities for resurgent patriotism in the EU in the future with this multipolar framework and its possibilities, as well as this idea of rearming? So if we could get your answer and then move around there to Frody and AA.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Also, just going back a bit to Prometheanism, I think the important thing is to understand it's strategic nationalism, but actually used and instrumentalized by globalists for certain nations. They just need to contain or to break up a continental empire, which is a concurrence to them on a global scale. And England always did this with the Festlandsdegen, the continental dagger or continental sword, and now the Americans have basically also followed this role. I think the strange thing here is that it was always right-wing people calling for the draft, for rearming, just like Yukio Mishima, for example, did in Japan, and especially for a national resilience, because if you want to defend the country, more important than tanks and the guns and shells is the willingness of young men to fight and to even die. So it's the love for the country, it's nationalism. You need a certain amount of nationalism to be able to defend your country. But this was combated by this bureaucratic monster of the European Union. They completely outsourced security to the United States of America. It became an export eunuch, like castrated geopolitically, but bloated and super fat in terms of economy. And now suddenly, out of the blue, they want to become a defensive power again, but without allowing back this nationalism and this ethno-cultural identity. So I think this whole thing is bound to fail. Definitely, if you poll now how many people are willing to defend their country, and I say if we have mass remigration, if we have an end of the anti-European, anti-white, and especially anti-German hatred, have a normal population policy, a normal identity policy on the state level again, then we could talk about this. But I agree with you at the moment, it's, I think, the last attempt by the European elites to save themselves, just like the old Soviet elites tried to save themselves in a way in the 1980s. In the end, failed. And I think that the European nations will not really follow that, especially European populations really don't want it. And I think the elites will utterly fail with this attempt.
Excellent. Frody?
Yeah, is there any particular question you want me to address, or just comment on the previous things that have been said?
Yeah, comment on whatever's been said previously, and I certainly want to hear your thoughts as regards the prospect of Europe rearming.
All right. Yes, Europe rearming. Of course, I mean, when the this has been a discussion. Well, America is encouraging Europe to rearm. So does that mean it's a bad thing? No, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's absolutely necessary, because what's happening now is that the old order is breaking apart, and we have to have an independent military power for Europe to become truly independent. That's a prerequisite. So Europe rearming is a prerequisite for Europe becoming independent, both from the US and from Russia. So Europe becoming sovereign, truly sovereign, and that's the goal. Because Europe being sovereign is a prerequisite for determining its own policy, which includes everything else, including remigration or whatever, reversing migration policy and so on. So it is in Europe's interest to become independent and becoming sovereign, and for that we have to have an independent military force. AA has talked about before. He probably has something to add about that. That this also happened with the British Empire, when the British Empire started encouraging its vassals to arm and to be more independent in the defense area. That also gave them the ability to become independent and get away from the empire, so to speak, or get away from British rule. So I think that's a prerequisite. It has to happen. With regard to Russia and the US, we now have a Europe with both the US and Russia being hostile to Europe. If we listen to the talks by Sergei Lavrov, by Sergei Karaganov, basically their goal is to remove Europe from the center of history, to make Europe less relevant. So they want Europe to be less powerful. So we're basically going back to a sort of a Molotov-Ribbentrop, not Molotov-Ribbentrop, Yalta 1945 kind of division of Europe between Russia and America in exercising power. And so it's definitely in Europe's interest to become an independent pole in this sort of quote-unquote multipolar order. And to do that, we have to rearm. Strategic nationalism, Martin brought up strategic nationalism, that the US and the West will encourage nationalism when it suits them. This is something that the US and Russia both have done. The US has allowed nationalism to exist in Eastern Europe because it's a buffer to Russia. And of course, that means that Eastern Europeans have a will to defend themselves. So they are now the only people willing to defend themselves and defend their countries in Europe. Russia has sort of done the same thing with when it started RT some 15 years ago, started encouraging sort of conservative values, basically setting that up as a bait for Western Europeans, that Russia understands you, we share your conservative values, we share your sort of discontent with your governments and so on. So they've encouraged a more conservative, more nationalistic ideas in the West, for the same reason, for the strategic reason of undermining American power. So they've done it on both sides of the aisle. What else was brought up here? The fifth, sort of the fifth columnist thing. This is that when that the European countries will accuse right-wingers for working for Putin and being fifth columnists. This is something that they've been trying to do for a long time, at least for 15 years. The establishment in the West, or the establishment in Europe, journalists and so on, they have been saying it for a long time, that right-wingers are sort of fifth columnists, or they carry water for Putin. Because, and I've talked about this for years, that this is sort of a form of Fed posting, so to speak, just like a sort of an entrapment type of thing, where the police will encourage people to say illegal things to give them an excuse to crack down on them. In the same way, they've encouraged and tried to create a connection between the nationalist groups or right-wingers in Europe and Russia, to give them an excuse to crack down on right-wingers when there's a conflict with Russia, because it's obviously a completely legitimate thing to crack down on fifth columnists in case of war. In the case of a conflict that might break out to a war, they become a genuine security risk. And so I've, for many years, talked about that as simply being a trap. For the first several years, that was, no one walked into the trap. But in recent years, more and more people seem to have walked into that trap. And so then we'll see more and more nationalist parties and so on actually being connected with Russia and walking into that trap. And so they'll risk being banned instead of doing anything useful. What else? AA brought up Homo Americanus, which was also a great book by Tom Sunich, which I read when it came out. I think it was in 2008. Another book I would like to add there is Nuremberg or the Promised Land by Maurice Bardesh. He's a French author. He wrote the book right after the Second World War. I think he wrote it in like 1947 or something like that. Basically, what he talked about was that the Nuremberg, or the paradigm that was created, or the ideology that was created at the end of the Second World War, wasn't just to punish Germany or to punish National Socialism. It was to punish nationalism of any kind, so that at Nuremberg, nationalism, national sovereignty became sort of an illegal thing. And basically it was sort of a utopian ideology that was created, similar to the French Revolution or Bolshevik Revolution, where basically we're going to create this utopian world, the promised land, where we remove nationalism and where we remove the idea of nationalism, because nationalism is the root of all evil. And that was created at Nuremberg with the US and Russia imposing that order on Europe, basically outlawing, banning nationalism in Europe. And we see now Russia definitely enforcing that in Eastern. So Russia is eager to hold on to that narrative or that paradigm, and they talk about denazification in Ukraine and so on. So that's an ideology that was created at Nuremberg, and a prerequisite for Europe to ever become free again is to break the deadlock, or break the grip of the post-World War II order, where US and Russia controlled Europe. And so that is the first order of priority, that we become sovereign before we can deal with any other issues. Because if we're not sovereign, then we're not going to determine our policy anyway. So I guess that's all I have to say. I don't think there was anything else that was said that I have anything to comment on. So I'll leave it over to you. Back to you, Semigog.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll bounce it right over to AA. Thank you for waiting patiently, sir. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I basically agree with the general line of Europe rearming is a good thing, and it, in the long run, will lead to a more autonomous Europe. The thing I'm quite skeptical about, or the thing that I cannot unsee, and I have to bring this up because it does color my view of a lot of things that are happening at the moment, and it's an elephant in the room that I think we all going to have to just confront at some point or another. There was a guy called Brian Baletic who runs this channel called New Atlas. Now he's a bit of a kind of China shill in a way, but his analysis of what has been happening vis-a-vis Trump and Ukraine and the current situation that we're watching play out at the moment, I can't really unsee it. It's like when somebody shows you a magic trick. In fact, the analogy I will have to make is when you're a kid at 8 years old and somebody points out to you that wrestling isn't really real. Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant are really friends behind the stage type thing. Well, Brian Baletic's take is that everything that we're watching at the moment has a level of fakery to it, right? By which he means Trump or the Americans aren't really serious about pursuing peace with Russia, and that what we watched in the White House with the Trump blowing up at Zelensky was a Punch and Judy show, and is basically a way of selling the idea of rearming to the Europeans, right? How are you going to what's the best way of motivating Europe to rearm? Well, let's do it to show Trump type thing. Okay, so for the European market, Trump gets to be a heel or a villain, if you want to put it that way. Whereas for the American domestic market, it's a way of basically, it's kind of like an off-ramp for America to get out, because America kind of got the things it wanted from Ukraine, blowing up Nord Stream, destroying the German-Russian alliance that was burgeoning, and it wants to now refocus onto China. Okay, so they developed a plan called Division of Labor, which was outlined by Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth gave a speech to the European Parliament where he literally outlined this plan. Okay, it was originally written in a paper by the Rand Institute 6 years ago, where they literally talked about a division of labor plan whereby Europe, quote unquote, deals with Russia and America deals with China. Okay, now the reason I bring this up is because it has some disturbing implications. Those implications being that more or less everything that the Trump administration does when it comes to foreign policy it's a kind of fakery to sell to the rubes back home. Okay, whereas what's actually happening is that the American government and the British government and the European government are still all working hand in glove. Okay, now I didn't want to believe this at first because I was actually initially quite excited by just because something happened, right? When those scenes in the White House with Zelensky and Trump arguing, I was like, wow, something happened. This is amazing. But then once I saw this, I was like, well, actually everything he said, everything Brian Baletic said has come to pass. Now we are, a month later? And what Trump said today, oh, Putin's pissing me off. I'm very angry at Putin, blah, 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 blah. So there's no actual peace deal coming. It's just a way of Trump showing his base, right, that he is able, like he made an effort to bring an end to this. And also I'm going to make the Europeans deal with this. But what Baletic is suggesting is that this was already the plan. This was the plan that predated the Trump admin coming in and goes all the way back to 2019. And in fact, goes all the way back to the Clinton era. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this suggests that the populism of the Trump admin is in a way not what it appears, right? That there's a degree to which everything that is said by Hegseth and Vance and Trump himself to an extent is basically designed to G up the base as what in this country would call red meat. Like the Tory party here. The Tory party always throw red meat to the base, okay? But actually it's just puffery, it's just smoke. Whereas what is really happening is business as usual. And it's just, if you notice with Trump's statements, he's always trying to differentiate himself from Biden all the time. Oh, the last guy, Biden did this, Biden did that. But there's a lot more continuity between Biden and Trump when it comes to these things that meets the eye. And the reason that makes me a little bit worried is because we're all talking about the actual breakup of this kind of massive structure, this post-World War II structure. But I watched the Davos, the World Economic Forum back in January. And the feeling by a lot of people is like, look, we're just going to wait. All we have to do is wait Trump out. All Trump really has to do is convince the rubes that he's for real. And basically the show can carry on as normal. And there's a large extent to which I think that is basically true. That all we're getting basically is a continuation of NATO, what NATO was already going to do, but they're just selling it to different domestic markets using this kind of pro wrestling logic, whereby, our media in this country has been absolutely hysterical since that bust up in the White House. It's been absolutely hysterical. Some of the stuff they ran on Vance has been insane. But the upshot is that the argument is, okay, well, let's show them by doing exactly what Pete Hegseth wanted us to do. And in fact, there is a Politico article where our defense secretary, John Healey, literally says, we did exactly what you wanted, with a picture of him shaking hands with Pete Hegseth. So I'm like, well, is there really a split here? Or is this basically a kind of cunning continuation of US hegemony? So that is something I want to throw on the table, because it's, as things are playing out right now, I do think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. So I don't know what you think about that, panel, everybody.
Yeah, so basically, and I'll turn this over to Martin momentarily. So basically what you're saying here is that if we define Europe as its ruling elites and the United States as its ruling elites, then it's very likely, based on your view, that they're not enemies at all, leaving aside the interests of the respective populations. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, and that basically a lot of the things that we're seeing are for slop domestic consumption. And this is why it becomes so critical of the Trump admin very recently. J.D. Vance especially, I think every statement that he makes is calculated in a way almost to appeal to he's ostensibly doing international relations, but I think every single thing he does is designed to appeal to an online audience, to online anons and shitlords, basically, which is a very odd way of doing business, because it does have ramifications beyond that. But I do wonder that if there's an extent to which all of our leaders understand this. There are odd things, like, for example, if Trump was really, really, really serious, where's the massive showdown with Keir Starmer? Where's the scene of every right winger's dream of Trump just losing it at Starmer? But it's not been like that. Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, who was Tony Blair's Svengali back in the day, is now the US ambassador. Every time I see him, he's got a smile like a Cheshire cat, because basically things are going according to plan when it comes to the British establishment. And they're just essentially here in this market, Trump is used as a villain, as a heel, as a cattle prod to get shit libs and leftists to support what they want to do. And in America, it's just a mirror image of that. Whereas Trump is used to sell things to a base that wouldn't usually go along with these things. So anyway,
can I just ask? Can I just jump in here just real quick? Because I agree with you. A lot of what Trump does, like 90% of it, is sort of political theater and pro wrestling showmanship and so on. And it's true that there's a lot of fakery in the sort of Trump populism, because the actual ideological differences aren't all that big between Trump and sort of the Biden administration, actually. And I've pointed this out many times before, that Trump is accused of being the one who pushes this sort of pivoting away from Europe idea. But the fact is that started before the election. It started long before Trump became president again. And even the Munich Security Conference in 2024, in February, a year ago, I mean, which was almost a year or many months before the election, one of the big themes there was European security without America, because America had started turning away from Europe already before Trump being elected. So this is not Trump's doing. I agree that a lot of that is fakery. But the point is that if it is in our interest to rearm, which I would argue that it is, does it really matter that the Americans want it? I mean, isn't it, if we see NATO's job being to keep the Germans down and the Americans in and all of that, if the American president tells Germany, look, you need to spend 5% on defense, isn't that like a gift from heaven? I mean, isn't that a very good thing? So my point, my only question, AA, is, isn't it? I mean, isn't it good to rearm? Just the fact that Americans want it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing.
I mean, I think perhaps the more prescient question to ask is, why would America, like, the rules of power are such that no power willingly contracts. It always wants to expand. Okay. And, you know, Donald Trump, you know, his basic character, he wants to be the biggest, the best, the bad. I mean, I don't believe for a second that Trump would willingly contract the US empire. So that, I think there's a bigger question as to, like, well, why is this happening? And it could be something as simple as, you know, from 2010 until now, America has racked up $17 trillion in debt, print off, which is more than from 1776 until 2010. Okay, just Fed printing money. They did it over COVID as well. I mean, every government printed a lot of money over COVID, but America really went for it. That was actually under Trump one point. That was the first Trump administration, which printed a lot of that money off. And then Janet Yellen and Joe Biden continued that. And it could be that America is actually reaching the limits of its, what do they call it, modern monetary theory. It could actually be that America can no longer afford to do this anymore, right? Which would then be the analogy for what you mentioned, when the British Empire, which was broke after World War I, then started telling India and all the rest of the colonies, look, you're going to have to pay for your own defense through your own taxation because we can't afford it anymore, basically, which then led to independent movements down the line. And in another strange analogy, a lot of those nationalist movements, like Gandhi, for example, were actually being prodded along by the British Empire. Like, there's one amazing report that I found once of the guy who was in charge of it. The guy who was like saying, look, these Indians aren't really up for this independence thing. The nationalist movement only has 5%. Like, this is a problem because we need to get it off the books. So it could actually be that America is in that point of its life cycle. But I guess the thing I worry about is that, how can I put this? Like, yeah, good things could come from it. But I also just wonder if under the hood, these people, because one of the things all of these books talk about, but especially the ones by the British authors, Imperial Obituary and the Unhappy Lords, and they were obsessed with the idea of a one world government being a threat. Okay, like using the auspices of the World Bank and the IMF and all of this structure that they built, that we would end up with a one world government, i.e. globalism. So America is a problem, yes, but what is America building? It's building globalism. And I guess this is my worry, that if these splits are in a way fake, right? And if the populists that we have in each of our countries are fake, because actually their real allegiance is to something else, some other project, let's say a country in the Middle East, whatever, you know what I'm talking about, then when these things which feel seismic actually end up in 5 or 10 years time or 15 years time being yet another nothing ever happens, when, oh, Trump is over, Vance doesn't win, now we've got Gavin Newsom as the president, and oh, the band's back together because nothing really changed. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like Trump is a firework that goes off in the sky, all of the little, you know, but once it's faded, once the light is gone, it's like nothing. You understand what I'm saying? Like that.
I get it, but I'm not going to hold on to the mic too much longer. I'm just a quick response. But I think generally that's what's happening. I know that everyone likes Neil Ferguson, but he was making the argument that that's basically Trump's job, is to cut down on spending because the U.S. can't keep it up anymore. I think it's dangerous to think that the U.S. has some sort of unique magic powers, that it's not vulnerable to the same sort of life cycles as other empires. I mean, America will see a decline, and what Trump is doing is he is kind of trying to cover up the decline with a lot of bluster and a lot of political theater. But the fact is that they are actually cutting down, and so I think this is just a necessary step for them. But over to Semyagog or whoever whose turn it is.
Yes, I'd love to have Martin's thoughts on anything he wishes to address, but also in particular this idea, the fundamental idea that AA set forth, which is that, in fact, there, at least at the level of the elites, there is no great disjunction. It is business as usual. A number of things come to mind, was Musk's support for the AFD business as usual. I know a lot of people will come in and say, oh, that's just Trump. It's like with the competing parties with the upcoming election in Canada. Actually, Trump was trying to keep the Liberals in power. What are your thoughts there on that, and anything else you might want to cover, Martin?
Yeah, I think definitely Trump got, in a way, what he wanted. He can get troops and resources out of Europe, pivot them to Asia, and Europe now will contribute more to NATO, has been shocked into that. But that is not actually what America wants. If we think and presuppose that they want a global domination, they cannot focus on Europe so much anymore, because they're also running out of troops in a way and of resources. So I think if America could, and if they really wanted to have this unipolar moment forever, and they could keep total control of Europe while at the same time engaging Asia, then they would keep the troops here. So I would say I agree with Frodi, whether it's a ploy or not. Definitely it gives us more possibilities in the future to become independent. And now if they talk about Europeanizing the production chains, that's definitely something that in the future will give us the possibility to become real sovereign, which I think is very good. And also I'm absolutely for Europe to become a sovereign power and being able to defend itself and being in par with America and Russia in that sense. But I also have to say, when we talk about we have to rearm, I want to ask, who is this we? Like, I have no we with the current European elites and those people who are displacing us and destroying us and banning us and persecuting us. They don't have a best interest in mind. And I really don't think that they will do anything to make Europe sovereign. Here, more, I would say, in the field, in the camp of academic agent, they just play along in a way. They siphon money out of all these contracts. And in the end, they also don't want to defend Europe against Russia. They will only use the threat from Russia, like in 1984, the war against Eurasia, as a tool like COVID to suppress us. So I think this we doesn't really exist. So I'm not very excited about this new militaristic talk. And also when it comes to sovereignty, I also would slightly disagree with Frodi said that sovereignty comes first before everything, because I think that a real total European sovereignty is something I want, but we don't really know when it will happen, how it will happen. We don't really know if the American empire will crumble and the multipolar world will rise within a lifetime. So if we go look at, for example, the French people, the Gallic tribes occupied by Rome, the question is, are we now in the year 100 after Christ, or are we in the year 270 after Christ, when there was this Gallic Empire, or are we in the year 470 after Christ, when the Western Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse? You don't really know it, but to know in which position we are is absolutely important and necessary. I also have to say, a lot of these geopolitical issues and questions for me very often seem like an escape from the grim reality of the fact that we, and this we is now a specific we as right-wingers, identitarians, nationalists, patriots, are completely powerless within our own nations, have no political control, and we cannot stop the flood of massive non-European replacement migrants into our country. And for me, this is the highest priority, and I think this is like more important than the idea of sovereignty, military sovereignty, which, in my opinion, is very hard to really pin down when it can happen in the future. It has to be an absolute target and goal, and we have to be totally focused on it against any foreign intervention. Obviously, I'm obviously for that, whether it be Moscow or Washington. But I think the real primary goal and issue has to be the question of how can we organize patriotic color revolutions in our own nations? How can we increase the power of the patriotic opposition in Europe? And how can we achieve at least a stop of migration and then remigration? And for me, as a remigration maxer, this is the frame with which I look at all these geopolitical questions.
This is something that I was very, very interested to hear from you, Martin. And if I may, I'd like to sort of build, as they like to say, build upon what you just said there. One of my primary concerns, and perhaps this is a good question to move through for this last part of the discussion. One of the things that has been most interesting to me, or the thing that I'm most concerned about, is how can we make the most of our current circumstances to ensure that we don't continue to be replaced in our own countries, and to ensure that we can perhaps turn that around. Now, I know, for example, AA is not a nationalist; he's a centrist, but he's given a great deal of thought to these.
Sensible centrist, yeah.
Yes, he's given a great deal of thought to these subjects, so I want to hear his thoughts too, certainly Frode's as well. But what we have here is a situation that can be construed as some sort of fundamental split between Europe and the US. It can also, and these are not mutually exclusive, I think it can also be construed as certainly some proportion of it being business as usual. But in these circumstances where there is this at least apparent tension, and at the level of populations, I get the impression the tension is real. I don't believe that every rando who appears on Twitter should be taken as an example of how the respective populations really think about things, but there is no doubt growing tension on the part of Americans, talking about Europors and saying things like, oh, we're so sick of paying for you. This was our charitable project and now it's time for you to pay. And then there are Europeans saying, wait, what the fuck? So the tension is real, regardless of whether or not the split, at least at the level of the ruling elites, is. So starting with you, Martin, and then moving around to everybody else, what are the opportunities we have here? How should we face this? Does it make sense to agitate and inflame differences, or does it make sense to find some basis of cooperation? Is it some combination of these things? And all of this should be, I think anyway, considered against the idea of nationalisms. How is it that people seeking to push forward the program of proper nationalism and some sort of return to the roots of nations understood as nations, how is it that they cooperate? One of the major things that has, I think, put wind in the sails of the idea of globalism was that, however foolishly, however utopian it doubtless is, the vast majority of the public was able to say, yeah, why can't we all just get along? There's no race. There's just the human race. We can cooperate. There's no reason to have these messy divergences based on national interests. Well, if we wish to push our respective national interests, then what are we to do with this situation? And again, all understood within the broader context of, what is the framework of cooperation among nationalists, all of whom at this point are more or less out of power? How are we to deal with this situation? What are its, what do they call it? The SWOT analysis: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, starting with you, Martin.
Yeah, very good. I will not go into these 4 parts. I just think it's very important to understand that this is a huge opportunity. It makes our elites look very weak and stupid. I think we shouldn't give them any success. We should try to take away any authority and any power they have. And I think this the coming pressure from America and from Russia at the same time. It was, I think, a Freudian slip when Frody was talking about the Molotov Pact, because we might have the fate of Poland when.
Oh, I also liked how Frody said America can't keep it up anymore. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a nice double entendre. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, you're right. So I think this pressure is in a way good, because it depletes their resources of bread and circuses to keep us down. But at the same time, I also don't have too many illusions. I really don't think that at the moment, especially demographically, the European people are really ready for a huge revolutionary change and movement. Plus, we also don't have a lot of elites that could replace the current elites. But I think we need to weaken to a point where they have to make kind of a compromise. And Trump, in a way, already was a compromise. So some people who are part of elite structures, but a bit outsiders, maybe a bit like Napoleon the Third, 1848 in France, with enough revolutionary pressure from patriots, with parties like the AfD, the Freedom Party, counter public, counter media, on the I would also say activism on the street, and then the pressures from outside. I think this can definitely help us. And I also have to say, at the moment, everything that weakens the European Union, everything that in a way balkanizes it, in my opinion, but you can maybe criticize this, in my opinion, at the moment is something good, because we can win easier on the smaller scale. For example, now in countries like Flanders, where I gave a speech at a remigration rally a few days ago, Vlaams Belang is the strongest party. If they would split from Belgium, we would have a right-wing ruled country. Austria, Freedom Party is above 30%. Also way easier to do politics here than if we were just one province of the huge Germanistan. So I think at the moment, this process of pressure from the outside, of loss of face for these elites, but also in a way of fragmentation, is something that is beneficial to the increase of people power of the patriotic opposition. But obviously, it does never mean that that we will lose this long-term goal of European sovereignty and European unity.
Very good. Thank you. Frody.
All right. Thank you for that. Yeah, Semigog, you asked what's the opportunity? What are the opportunities right now? And I think there are great opportunities. I'm going to push back just a gently, friendly pushback against some of the things that Martin said, because I do think that there is an opportunity here. Because what is the reason that people in Europe and people in the West have no will to join the army or have no will to defend their countries? It's because we have been taught that patriotism, nationalism are evil things. You're a bad person if you want to defend your country, and you shouldn't do that. You should be punished. You should be persecuted, in fact, if you want to defend your country. And that is actually a golden opportunity now, because I'm talking about myself and other European nationalists, have a golden opportunity because we are the only ones who credibly can say that we actually do want to defend our countries, and willingly or unwillingly, the Western governments are now saying that actually, well, you're supposed to do that, and so they are sort of contradicting themselves, because they have been saying for a long time that it's actually bad to defend your country, national sovereignty doesn't matter, and so on. But now all of a sudden it's actually important because Russia is now the threat. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, this is why I have been very critical of the so-called Russia shills, or whatever we want to call them in a polite way, because you don't want to do the other sort of contradictory thing either, and say that, well, I care about like immigration, but I don't care about national security. Because it's not a credible message to say that screw our national security now because I don't like the current government. because if there's going to be an opportunity for a new elite to rise, you have to have the country. So you have to have a consistent message. And the consistent message is that we are the only ones who actually have a credible message. We are the only ones who want to create a country where we both have strong national defense and where we actually have strong borders. We want to defend our borders against both military attack and against other types of incursion into our countries. And so we have to have a consistent and credible message, because that is what the establishment lacks. That's why they're unable to deal with this situation. And so we have to maintain a level of credibility and consistency, because the problem is that if we believe that remigration or that other issues of national sovereignty are important, we can't associate remigration with betrayal of your country, or that it doesn't matter, national security doesn't matter. But that's not a credible combination. So that if we associate and connect nationalism or remigration with sort of antisocial issues, then that issue becomes lacks credibility, loses credibility, and that's not possible. So I think that the greatest opportunity we have right now is to support a message which is consistent with nationalism, strong defense, strong national security, and strong borders, and get the people who don't belong in our countries, get them to deport them or get them out of our countries. That is the only way forward. And I don't want to end up in a sort of a reactionary message where it's just, well, we're going to have to guess what do the American elites want now, and we're going to try to do the opposite of that, or what do the Russians elite want, and we're going to try to do no, we're going to have our own agenda, and our own agenda is nationalism in every area, which includes national security and ethnic border security and so on. I think that's I mean, we're the only ones who can credibly push that message. And that gives us a huge opportunity right now.
I want to respond because it was a criticism point. I think you're right. You have to have a cohesive message, and obviously you always have to clearly say that the end goal is a sovereign Europe, nation states who are armed and who don't hope for world peace or benevolent neighbors, but would be able to defend themselves. But I think at the moment, and now I'm talking also as a populist, as an activist, when those traitorous political elites who have been replacing us and persecuting us for decades suddenly say, now we need your patriotism, now we need you to defend the country. The obvious answer, and that's also if you talk to anybody who votes the AfD, the Front National, to any normal right-wing person on the street, is you cannot even secure our borders. You cannot even secure inner cities that do gang rapes every day. Just shut up, sorry, I hope I'm not destroying the YouTube algorithm or channel here. First of all, we need to clear you out. We need to have a clear change. We need to have elites we actually trust. We need to stop the demographic replacement, and we need to stop the anti-European, anti-white hatred in our schools and all of this. And then we have something that we will fight for and defend for. And I think that's the way how you need to put this argument. Because if you sit now by idly as a patriotic opposition and vote for all the things, these motions in parliament right now that they're doing, then you would completely use your voter base and your authenticity. So that's also, I think, a very important issue where I need to separate between political strategy and theory. So I think we both agree that there's a chance, but I think we might disagree in how exactly this chance look like.
No, I think that's. I mean, I agree with that point, and I think, I mean, that is the thing that I think. Well, at least I have, but others also have spent time now pointing out the hypocrisy that all of a sudden now our borders are important again. I mean, that is important. We should point out that hypocrisy, but we should also have our own agenda and our own vision, and not just be reactionary and say that sort of out of spite. No, we don't want to protect our borders now because you're in charge. we have to just have our own vision and not just be reactionary. I think that's my
I
main
agree.
point, because I think that a lot of people have sort of failed that. They've just kind of been bitter against the current rulers, and then sort of just want to see it all burn or something like that. And I don't think that's a way forward. I just think we have to have our own message, and at the same time point out the hypocrisy of the current governments. But the only way we can point out that hypocrisy is to not have the same hypocrisy ourselves. So I think we basically agree on those points, I think.
Absolutely. I think we also can expand it maybe in a conversation only about this. I think we also basically agree, but I think still that very pragmatically, and that's basically my point, we need to use this crisis to make them lose their authority, and we should not become useful idiots who now, because you just wave with some nationalist symbols and slogans, do everything they want for those elites. And I really think that the enemy, and that's my closing point also, depending how long we still talk, the real enemy is within. So all of these other countries are adversaries, Russia, America, China, the geopolitical adversaries, and the people never has eternal enemies. It has eternal interests. But the real enemy, the existential threat, is this, let's call it the woke mind virus, to also quote Elon Musk here, and our own elites who are controlled by it. And I think that's a very important priority to understand, that because if you don't get rid of them, if you don't overpower them and clear them out, then we will not exist as people anymore in the next decades. And that's, I think, the most important priority.
It certainly fits with, if you assume that there is a break between the United States and Europe, then it presents an opportunity to put pressure on elites in Europe. Of course, I'm not a European. I can't, speak with a view on the ground, of course, but it would seem that there's the opportunity to go after your elites. Likewise, if in fact it is business as usual, then you still have the opportunity to go after your own elites, because they are at least the most immediate of the obstacles that stands in the way towards between each of these nations, populations, and sovereignty, however defined. But AA has been waiting very patiently. What are your thoughts, sir?
Well, I mean, the last in-person talk I gave, at an actual event in the summer, was called, the title of the talk was called Tuning Out the Clown Show. Tuning Out the Clown Show. Okay. And unfortunately, what's happened is that the American government has become its own kind of permanent clown show. One of Shakespeare's plays, Henry IV Part 2, there's a scene where Henry IV, who was a king who basically started a civil war in this country by killing Richard II. Right? He was a usurper. He killed Richard II and became the king, which then led to rebellions against him. So Henry IV spends his entire reign putting down domestic squabbles. And then he has this scene with his son, who becomes Henry V, and he says, "Be it thy course to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels." Right? Now, if you think about what the Trump admin has been doing with these kind of bellicose attacks on Canada and Denmark and talking about Greenland and all this sort of stuff, that's kind of what he's been doing, like distracting their own base with all of this bellicose talk against Europeans and all of this. I mean, I tend to think that maybe 75% of the people we interact with on Twitter now are Indians or bots or something. I don't believe all these people are real half the time, but it's certainly they've been programmed, these people, or have a go at Europeans, keep the base animated against Europeans. And this was basically the play of Henry IV. And what does Henry V do? He restarts a war in France, and the civil war back home dies off because everybody hates the French now, right? This is like an old strategy. But to Martin's point, I mean, I had a look at the current demographics. US population is 58% non-Hispanic white. That was the last estimate in 2023. Okay. Under Trump, the deportations are lower. He's deporting at a lower rate than Joe Biden. He's actually deporting at a lower rate than Keir Starmer. Okay, so in that context, let's pretend you're an American nationalist now who wants some of these things that Martin and Frode have been talking about. How does it help that cause for J.D. Vance to then lecture Denmark, which is a 92% white country with an extremely robust one of the few European countries to develop an actually robust anti-immigration program? Okay, and it was actually their leftist party who did it as well. Though I've since learned today that there's a long history to that, and both their parties have been anti-immigration for quite a long time.
Yes, it's 2010 and then a big push in 2019. Yeah, quite correct.
Yeah. So, but what I'm saying is, like J.D. Vance, like lecturing them like a kind of Karen, like, okay, that may G up the base for 5 minutes on Twitter, but it's not like, how does that actually solve the underlying issue that everybody cares about, which is that bottom line number I just read out? Okay. And how does it help anyone in Denmark, right, who cares about, making that 92% number go up over time? So I guess my bottom line is that the kind of clown show, the slop, the kind of Twitter maelstrom, the nonsense that we face day to day, right, in this country, I told everybody 2 years ago, look, Nigel Farage was just going to lead you up the garden path again. Okay, and this is the problem with populism in every nation, right? As far as I know, the Trump admin has never even mentioned those demographic numbers and don't even care about it. Nigel Farage, now cometh the hour, and people are actually talking about remigration in this country, and we've got the Labour government doing deportations and running videos of literally brown people being arrested and drummed out of the country to like techno music. I'm not even making this up. But and at this moment, now you've got this kind of fake populist, now he gets cold feet. Now he doesn't want to do it anymore. And this is the thing I worry about in every country, not just Britain and America, but like in France and I see signs. When I watched a bit of that conversation with Elon Musk and the AFD, and I was like, there were some elements of there. Like, I've seen this before, So, and this is I guess what I worry about, is that if the things that Martin talked about are the things that you care about, then how much time and energy and attention do you want to waste on all of this stuff, right? Because what I see happening now is that everybody's caught up in all of these things. But when 2028 rolls around and the next lot of census numbers come in, is that stat I read out going to go, is it going to even be closer to 50-50? Is it going to be because that is the only actual thing that matters for a lot of people. And the more energy you spend on this sort of stuff, on these sorts of kind of nonsensical ephemera, right, the longer it gets. And now it's another 10 years down the line, and all we've done is waste time. You understand what I'm saying, right? And to me, this is the most frustrating thing, because there's been so many false dawns, right? I remember who were the great Swedish hope? You'll remind me, Frode, but like, what happened to
Sweden
that?
Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, what happened to all of that? Do you know what I mean? Or like, did the iron law of oligarchy, right, prevail, and did they moderate to the point where they're just another Nigel Farage now, or dare I say it, just another Trump?
Yeah, the Sweden Democrats were. I will say that they did have a major effect in 2010 when they first got into parliament, when they first got over 4%, which is what you need to get into parliament, because it was like overnight shift where before that people didn't talk about immigration at all. That was not like a legitimate topic. But after that, like, people who would never have brought it up, my own acquaintances and so on, they were perfectly comfortable talking about mass immigration as a problem. So they did have a sort of a slight meta-political effect in 2010, but now they have been watered down to be completely useless. And so, I think that supports your point, that they have been, in order to try, because they sort of lack any ideological conviction, and they're just populists. they've tried to sort of appeal to and get approval from the establishment to the extent that they're sort of lost. They don't have any point anymore.
But my overall point, I mean, I watched a video the other day of Marjorie Taylor Greene, right, losing it at some like BBC journalist or something like that, and she just kind of says, "What, you're from Britain?" Blah blah blah. She just kind of like shouts throughout the room type thing, you know. And I'm like, well, okay, this gets people excited in the moment, populist energy and so on, but it's not actually like it doesn't actually end up with the outcomes that we want. And this is the thing that I increasingly worry about, that all of these kind of populist parties that are dealt our way are basically just one giant containment mechanism to waste everybody's time. And meanwhile, that demographic clock ticks and still nothing's been sorted out. So, and anyway, that's just my 2 pennies.
Cheerful take. Your cheerful and optimistic take.
If I might again respond to that, I would agree with you partially. I don't see that negatively. And if you look at the overall trend, there is an increase in right-wing parties. But I agree with you insofar as those parties, if they only focus on the parliament, on electoral victories, or as we say, the political cinematic universe, and not focus on the real centers of power in the society, then obviously this is just, as you wrote in your book, which I obviously also read, is a delusion. So I think the most important thing for us, right-wing activists, intellectuals, is to sharpen the focus, on the real power sources, the ideological state apparatus, the meta-political power centers. And I think here there's definitely a huge chance, and now we go in a completely different area. One cannot deny there's an increase in the freedom of opinion, because we all now can communicate on X, and also YouTube isn't censoring that much anymore. Of course, there are limits. We know those limits to this newfound freedom of expression, but that's definitely a trend that's going on. So in the whole globalistic scheme, this, I would say, more socialistic idea of the world state, the world technocracy, is, I think, a bit at the moment, for a while, replaced by this idea of anarcho-capitalism. You might say that's also just a ruse and it's just fake, but it's a reality that today there's more freedom of opinion. We can use this to spread our idea, to spread a message, and to try to build up more meta-political power. And I think that's, in the end, what really counts. But I agree with you. You can measure meta-political power also in a way if you look at the universities, at the student votes, and the student votes of all European countries where the populist parties are bloated and very high are very, very, very low, like 1%, 1.5%. And this just shows that these parties are giants, political parliamentary giants, but metapolitical ideological dwarfs. And I agree with you that if this is also your point, but my point is, yes, we need to focus more on the actual power center. The parliament is more a stage, and the power centers are financial elites, many other groups that we can really touch or become. But one pillar of power, which is ideology, language, media, metapolitics, that's something we can definitely influence if you focus more energy, resources, and money and time on it.
Well said. We are coming up now on the 2-hour limit, and I want to be sensitive to the time requirements of my guests who have so kindly shared their time with me and with all of you. So I would say perhaps this is a good time to roll back through, maybe starting with Frody, then AA, then Martin, for any final things that you think should be mentioned that you didn't have a chance to mention, any final points, and also to tell people again where they can find you, where they can follow your work, and any projects that you may have coming up.
All right, thank you for that. I think both Martin and AA made some very good points. I think I agree with Martin's point that there's been a big change coming now in for about 2 years or so, where free speech has opened up. So cancel culture has been canceled finally, and hopefully that will last as well. And we do have to give Trump and Musk and so on some credit for being part of that. I don't want to give them all the credit, because there are other factors that are sort of beyond their control as well, and so on. But they have played a role, and I think it's fair to give them some credit for that. And that's a very good thing, because we do see a normalization of discourse, and we should celebrate that victory. At the same time, I agree with what AA brought up there, that the sort of this populist stuff has a tendency to really undermine serious work. And so one of the effects of Trumpism is that it sort of melts the brains of a lot of its own supporters. So populism, there's a risk with populism that if you become too invested in it, that you just get caught up in these sort of trivial things, and the trivial things that Trump does. And one of the things that I've cautioned my American friends and my American followers is that, you know, you can actually vote for Trump. It's not. I mean, I don't blame you for voting for Trump. And if you don't want to vote for Biden, or if you don't want to abstain or whatever, if you want to vote for Trump, that's one thing. It's another thing to get invested in Trump and start identifying as a Trump voter or a Trump supporter, and start defending all the crazy stuff that he does, because that only undermines your own power. So I just urge my American friends to not walk into that trap and become hijacked by populist insanity, because that's not the main game here. The main game is the actual sort of shift in the fundamental issues. And Trump isn't all that great on fundamental issues, to be perfectly honest. He might do some things that are good, some things that are bad, but don't get distracted and hijacked by populism, I guess, is the thing I want to say. Other than that, was there anything else? Again, I just want to repeat what I said earlier. I caution also against reactionary thinking. That's not wise. Have your own agenda and push your own agenda and your own vision. Don't just be reactionary to whatever the establishment's agenda is or whatever, because that doesn't give you any credibility. So I think it's very important now that we have a golden opportunity. We have a monopoly on the only solution to this problem. So we should make the most of that. So thank you so much for having me on the show. You'll find my work on gtkradio.com, on Twitter, on Telegram. It's Guide to Culture, and culture is Kulchur. It's a book by Ezra Pound. Pardon the weird spelling, but Guide to Culture. And on Twitter, it's real_GTK, real_GTK. And you'll find all the other stuff via that. So gtkradio.com, I think, is the easiest address. And then you can just find everything else through that. And finally, I just want to say thank you so much to Semigog for having me on, and to Martin and AA for this great conversation. I think it was a valuable conversation, and I hope all the listeners have enjoyed it too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Freddie, and thanks very much for taking the time to be here. AA, your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I mean, just so I don't sound like totally black-pilled, I mean, I have odd hopes in other ways, which is that I have long believed, I mean, to use the Denmark example, I have long believed that the best hope of getting what we want in the current circumstances
is to vote for leftists.
Well, it's basically to create a pressure environment where the left, who are generally more serious and more kind of actually end up doing the things you want, right? So in a strange way, in this country, I absolutely believe that Keir Starmer will be more effective at deportations and reducing migration than either the Tories, who are just fucking hopeless, or Nigel Farage. Like, let's pretend Nigel Farage became the Prime Minister. I just think he'd be less effective. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but you know, how can I put this? Like, when the left decide to do something, they don't mess around in the same way. Whereas for some reason, because of the essential grift and fakery around some of these kind of centre-right or populist parties, I just don't believe they'll actually do anything when they get in. So, in a strange way, I still think our best hope is to actually do it through the established parties. Like in France, even possibly Macron would be more effective than Le Pen. But this sounds very odd. But at the minute, it's our best. It's the best shot. I genuinely believe Mark Carney will reduce migration faster than Trump will, for example. So this is like, it's a weird sort of white pill because we still have these fuckers in charge. But in a way, if the system's doing what you want, that's the best we can hope for, right? So I've given up hope of ever clearing them out in our lifetimes. But
I actually second
that. That's the second best, So anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that, to be honest.
Yes, well, yes, we will see. There is when things shift, and parties change, there are opportunities, as I'm sure AA knows. When the Mensheviks came in and the Bolsheviks said, no, we're going to do this a bit differently than you might have imagined. Yes, but staying clear of that, since we're coming to the end here. Thank you, AA, very much for being here. Thank you. And Martin, your final words, sir.
Yeah, first of all, also thank you very much for inviting me. I know I'm also kind of a controversial figure, so also thank you very much for the other guests to come. Again, want to focus on the positive things. 1 year ago, people like me were banned from Twitter, and now the past days we've seen Studio Ghibli edits of all kind of right-wing images going viral. By the way, wait for it, my take was Remigrated Away. That should be the new Studio Ghibli movie. So I think a lot of positive things are happening that we can actually use. Mao said once, there's great chaos under heaven and the situation is excellent. And I also see it a bit like that. This chaos and these problems they're all facing and these big shifts, they could become a ladder for us patriots. And I have to say, in the end, I really don't care who starts remigration, who brings people home, who shuts down the borders. I don't have any party affiliation. I have ideological affiliation to ideological goals. And politicians are not leaders, they're always followers. And we need to try to strategize and think how we can increase our cultural, our political power. And I think there's a lot of resources that are not being used strategically in that sense, in that way. So that's my hope, that there's a lot of potential that has not been used right now and it could be unleashed in the next years. And I just want to end it with my closing statement, also from the demonstration in Ghent a few days ago. The struggle will be hard, the victory will be historic, and our revenge will be the laughter of our children. Sorry, AA, for quoting an Irishman at the end, but thank you very much for taking the time and having this great conversation.
Yes. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much. It's an honor to have you all. I'm very happy you were willing to come. So yes, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our viewers. I appreciate you being here. I hope you will go and follow all of these gentlemen, Frody, AA, and Herr Zellner. And until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.